Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan Daly, and I'm the Sustainability Marketing Manager at NSF International, and I'm going to be the moderator during today's webinar on ISO 21930, implementing the 2017 version. Our main speaker today is Doug Mazeffa, who I'll introduce in a second. Program Operator Consortium goal is to provide simpler, standardized, and more useful solutions. Consortium is your expert resource and advocate for creating standardized product category rules, reviewing lifecycle assessment reports, and verifying and publishing your choice of Type 3 Environmental Declaration formats, EPDs, and Sustainable Mines Transparency Reports. Goals of the POC are to provide more useful environmental product transparency solutions and to reduce complexity in the marketplace by standardizing how LCIA-based standards for reporting product environmental performance get created, providing improved reports to help decision makers specify materials and products, and combining efforts to improve access to and recognition of manufacturers' product transparency reports. This webinar is the third in an ongoing series this year. May 3, the power of LCA in the built environment. July 18, new benchmarking guidance. And now ISO 21930. This will be available online in addition to the two previously recorded ones. And keep an eye out for our next webinar on final benchmarking guidance. Our speaker today, Doug Mazeffa, is an environmental project manager for the Sherwin-Williams company and a leading expert in lifecycle assessment, green chemistry, and environmental impact analysis. He has extensive expertise in the development and publication of product category rules, lifecycle assessments, and environmental product declarations. In fact, his LCA work was recently recognized by the coatings industry, where he was presented with the 2016 Industry Achievement Award from the American Coatings Association. With that, I'll hand it off to you, Doug.
Thank you, Ryan. So this is Doug Mazeffa, and I'll be presenting today on ISO 21930, specifically the 2017 revision. And so we'll start off with just some background, some general information, and then we'll dive into kind of what this means for LCA practitioners. Obviously, the majority of the folks on this call, that will be, very applicable to you. And then we'll go into the weeds a bit and talk about some of the specific similarities and differences from the 2007 version versus the new version. And then we'll close with some references, some additional guides you can refer to. There are a few concerns I'm going to raise that I've noticed in my review of the standard, and then some final thoughts. And then when I'm finished, we'll hand it over to Kim Lewis from Sustainable Mines, who will talk about the Program Operators Consortium and how the revised 21930 will influence or will be referenced in some of their compatibility appendices. So for those of you who aren't familiar with ISO 21930, its formal title is Sustainability in Buildings and Civil Engineering Works, Core Rules for Environmental Product Declarations of Construction Products and Services. This is why we call it 21930, very long standard. It's one of the primary standards for PCR, LCA, and EPD development for building materials. So it's specifically named in lead version 4 as one of the two standards, the other being EN 15804 for conformant environmental product declaration. So it's one of the more common standards utilized in the marketplace right now for construction works. The past version, or the legacy version, as you'll hear me call it, is the ISO 21930 2007. This has, of course, been revised. The new version was made publicly available in July of this year. I feel like most people are aware of this at this point in time. That's not to say it was just recently updated. It was actually a very long, ongoing process. So I believe it was actually under development or under revision for several years. And so, the first takeaway from this is that any new PCR that's developed, so a PCR that hasn't, begun its construction yet and is, starting today or tomorrow, have to use this new 21930 guidance if they want to use a 21930 guidance. And for existing PCRs, once they are next updated, in their revision cycle, or if major changes are made, they will then have to update their product category rule backing to be conformant with the new 21930 version. So most PCRs, it's between a 3 to 5 year revision cycle. So over the next several years, the PCRs that are out there that reference 21930 will have to switch over to the 2017 version. EPDs use whatever version of ISO is stipulated in the reference PCR. So if your PCR has been published for a while or before July, presumably, you would still use the 2007 version of 21930. And as soon as your kind of core product category rule is updated, that's when you would begin to utilize presumably the 2017 guidance. And so this is important because, as you'll see, there's a fairly substantial shift from the past version to the current version. So one of the questions I've been asked as someone in industry is, why do some industries prefer 21930 over EN 15804? Historically, the kind of thought process was 15804 was geared more towards the European market in terms of its assumptions. And so 21930, because of its kind of inherent flexibility, especially in the reporting structure, was seemingly more ideal for the US marketplace. Also, 21930 did require less kind of granularity in the EPDs, and specifically in terms of the module reporting, it was just a lot more straightforward. There was a small fraction of the number of numbers you had to report in the EPD itself. There were also some concerns that certain groups raised that some of the U.S. inventories in regards to kind of cutoff criteria or completeness might not have been able to meet some of the specific thresholds in 15804. Honestly, we all know cutoff criteria and completeness are kind of best guesses. There's not a true way of calculating those, so it's always a little bit subjective. And a lot of these things now you'll see that the new 21930 is much closer to 15804. It's very, very close. So I think it'll be interesting to see how the market kind of teases out these two standards now that they're actually quite aligned. And in fact, in 21930, you will see 15804 referenced in some specific sections. So a few things to consider before I really start going off in some details here. I want to be very clear that what I'm presenting here today is my interpretation of this standard. With all LCA standards, particularly ISO standards, a lot of the sections are going to be open to interpretation, how you define certain terms and how you understand certain concepts. So I want to encourage you, if you have specific questions, it's very important that your program operators that you're using, and especially your reviewers, that there's a dialogue that takes place with those groups, because ultimately those are the folks that you're going to have to make sure understand what you're doing in your LCAs or EPDs or PCRs. So I'm taking kind of an industry-centric sort of mindset with this. I am not one of the authors of this standard, so I just want to be transparent with this. I'm someone who's used 21930 a lot, and this is what I've walked away from it, playing with it for several months now. And given its newness, certainly expect a learning curve at first, both in terms of doing LCA work and also the review side of it. I certainly have spoken to a number of kind of key reviewers in the LCA industry who have mentioned to me that they have to redo their templates or their kind of checklists that they use for review purposes. So it's nothing to be afraid of. It's kind of a natural consequence of things changing, but just be cognizant that your first EPDs you do or the first PCR you do off of the new 21930 might be a lot more challenging if you had gotten very comfortable with the existing 21930 framework. So generally speaking, as I mentioned previously, the new version 21930 is very aligned with 15804. So one of the things a lot of folks will notice right away is that it actually adopts the EN 15804 module reporting. So it's no longer just stage 1, 2, 3, and 4. It's A1 through A5, B1 through B7, and so on and so forth. And this is something that, personally speaking, I'm a little bit concerned about, given the way that EPDs are being used for building products, namely that they're being kind of thrust in the hands of non-practitioners. And we've already had a fair amount of pushback from customers saying, hey, these are great, but they're, EPDs are very complicated. So I'm a little bit concerned with that, but I'll touch more on that later. Largely speaking, I think the changes were all very good. It's certainly more detailed. I kind of half tongue-in-cheek say that it went from a 24-page standard to about a 92-page standard. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing because a lot of that is that very specific guidance is given. So functional units, not just a paragraph anymore, or system boundaries, not just a couple of pages. Really, there's a lot of specific examples given, and it tries to be as clear as possible about when to do certain things. And so I really think the author should be applauded for trying to arm practitioners to do things in a more kind of consistent sort of way, because let's face it, there's still a lot of issues out there with PCRs regarding kind of credibility and rigor. So I would argue that the new 21930 is more rigorous and specific, that this could be perceived as a barrier to entry to groups or industries that are kind of newer to LCA and EPDs. That's not necessarily a bad thing. But a lot of groups who maybe aren't as kind of savvy with LCA may have to engage a consultant to do their first product category rule, whereas before they could have just powered through with a program operator. So, once again, be aware, but I don't think this should be viewed as a negative thing. I do want to point out too that the end-of-life modeling is actually fairly different, I guess in the sense that there's some specific requirements you have to do. And, I want to call out, and I won't go too deep today just in the nature of the interest of time, but the new module D really is set up very differently than stage 4 was in the legacy 21930. So that'll affect some industries more than others, but certainly be aware of that. So another question I get asked by a lot of folks is, can I just reuse my old LCA models? I spent a lot of time and money building these models. How much pain is it going to be for me in terms of my modeling? The unfortunate part is it's kind of the stock LCA answer of it depends. Speaking, kind of bluntly, that the closer you were to 15804, or kind of what I would call LCA best practices, not to say that 15804 always represented best practices, but the more kind of conservative you were and tended to overestimate impacts and just be very careful and diligent in your models, you really might not have that much trouble getting your kind of models up to speed for the new 21930. I mean, at a minimum, I would expect you to have to reorganize the information just because of the 17 modules from the kind of 4-stage process. So it could be that all you really need to do is reorganize your LCA models to be conformant. But you do need to consider that there are some different accounting practices, things like polluter pays, some of the carbon accounting, and also the end-of-life assumptions. So look at those very carefully. Once again, some industries may have to make a lot of changes based off of what they were doing before, but others, it actually might be reasonably turnkey, let's say. And this is probably obvious to say, but if you had a cradle-to-gate PCR, there's kind of less moving pieces. So that actually, in most cases will require less revision than a cradle-to-grave LCA. Of course, there's exceptions there, but I think, that should be fairly consistent. So I mentioned the module reporting framework. The image I have below is not the one in the standard. I know ISO gets kind of cagey about reproducing their images. So this is actually one from, I believe, 15804. It's more or less comparable or almost identical to what's in 21930 now. So you can feel confident kind of looking at this, but I would encourage you to get the standard if you have not done so. So the takeaway here is, lots of stages. You have to report things across 17 modules. What's kind of problematic for some industries is in the use stage, kind of B1 through B7, but namely B2, B3, B4, B5, it's a really blurry line between some of those. And I've been on calls with LCA groups where we argue for quite a long period of time about what constitutes a maintenance versus repair versus replacement versus refurbishment. So I would certainly recommend in the PCRs to spell that out as clearly as possible, because some of those terms are used differently by industry versus in this standard. And as I mentioned, we're reporting a lot more numbers now. So if it actually says in the guidance you cannot just summarize these into A, B, C, and D. You have to report them individually. So certainly expect to have a kind of a large table in your EPD. And this could open the door for more sort of summary sort of reports, but that's going to be case to case for your industry. So in terms of documentation and confidentiality, two very important things for those of us in industry. Really, it's pretty similar to the past version. You still do the LCIA report, and the EPD sort of acts as a summary of that information. There are, I would say, more specific requirements outlined by the new guidance versus what had been done in the legacy version. And one thing I want to make sure is clear to folks on here, because there's been some kind of noise in the marketplace. You're under no obligation to release your full LCIA report. If certainly people can request that from the manufacturer, not the program operator. And so you certainly can publish it if you want to, but ISO gives a very broad berth to confidential information, and it understands that the LCIA report, in the nature of being transparent, is really loaded with confidential information. So it's a possibility, but don't think that you ever have to publish your 150-page LCIA report. You can certainly give more, but that can certainly be on a case-by-case basis. And in regards to, so confidentiality is really quite similar to what was done before. It's pretty broad and allows companies to actually kind of say what is confidential and what's not. So once again, I would recommend making that as clear as possible in the PCR, so that there's not an opportunity to try to hide things under the pretense of confidentiality when really someone just doesn't want to report something. So declared versus functional unit, I feel like most people on this call should already be more than comfortable with this. Admittedly, it's a bit of a pet peeve of mine when people use it interchangeably, and I unfortunately see it a fair amount. So I was quite pleased to see in this guidance that there is quite a lot of time spent being, here's where you use declared unit, here's where you use functional unit, and here are the limitations of sort of both. So, if you already have this kind of down cold, you shouldn't see any sort of, heartburn or change necessary. But I do think this will help with some of the kind of misinformation or confusion that's out there in the marketplace. It really dedicates, I think it's like 4 or 5 pages just to, when you should be using declared versus functional and the limitations of that. And it does imply, and I say imply because in one section, it doesn't seem like 100% requirement, and in another section, it does say shall do it this way. So it's kind of true to form with ISO. But, my read of this is if you're going to do any sort of, I'll say, comparison, define that however you want to, that you have to not only have a functional unit, but it needs to be a kind of holistic cradle to grave sort of study, but all modules need to be considered. So, I don't disagree with that. I don't think we should be doing comparisons off of declared ever. I think that without performance and functionality, that's kind of incomplete at best and misleading at worst. So, so I think this is great, but I do expect that there might be some pushback regarding some of the specificity in there. So reference service life, also very similar to what it was before. It's certainly more built out. You'll see it reference ISO 15686. One thing that I love, and it does this in a few cases throughout the standard for other sections, is it basically says, hey, we understand that different industries have different ways of assessing service life and performance. So if your industry has a way of doing this, by all means use it. Obviously the way the coating industry does performance is going to be better than a generic way that, we could stipulate for all building products or for insulation or flooring, whatever. So I very much appreciate this because, we've run into a lot of issues in industry where there's kind of one set of guidance that tries to fit for every different type of product. And, our industry making a reactive product that can be applied on anything, it doesn't really hold up very cleanly under a lot of those. So, our industry already does this in our PCR. I'm sure a lot of others do as well, but it was very nice to see the authors actually say, hey, we understand industry, different product types may have to do this differently than just some general guidance. System boundary, this is where you're going to start seeing some big changes. I already mentioned, the module reporting. And I should point out too, there are going to be a number of folks that love the reporting. I know a lot of LCA practitioners like seeing that detail. So, I want to be transparent that certainly it's not something that's largely unpopular. My concern with it is mostly because of how EPDs are being used by programs such as LEAD. So, I think there's kind of a communication issue that this may present. But, by and large, it's certainly a more complete sort of way of reporting your impact assessments and also your resource metrics. Some other things to note is, throughout the guidance, it stipulates polluter pays principle throughout. So, it's unclear to me if that's going to be enforceable. You could argue, or I've heard some folks argue that, other ISO guidances say there's no one correct way to do LCA. So how can there be just, one way of kind of viewing this type of accounting? But, I think a lot of us do it this way, so I don't think that's necessarily a problem. And I want to call out Table 1 on pages 30 through 32. These are very important to your understanding. It really, once again, gives specific guidance about certain instances or issues you may run into and how to handle each of those. And generally speaking, it really says, it explicitly says, use conservative estimates for everything. And so if you have a tendency to err on the side of caution or wastage or whatever, I think you're going to be, fairly well off with this. So I once again, I think that's kind of a best practice, not to be trying to be hyper aggressive in some of the accounting assumptions of LCA. And so, as I mentioned, it does explicitly say that you can't just do a summary of the results, but it's not clear if you report for every module, that if you, under no circumstance, can have a summary. So you may be able to summarize the results and just include the 17 modules as an appendix. That's something you're going to have to discuss with your program operator, your reviewers. So once again, everything I'm saying here, please, it's reviewers view things in different ways. So it's very important to have that dialogue, because some might be quite comfortable with it and say, oh yeah, that's fine. It's, we understand how this is being used and that makes sense. Others might be, very picky about it and say, no, you have to report this one way and that's it. So certainly have those conversations. Allocation and cutoff rules. I was actually surprised about some of the changes that were made to this section. Interestingly enough, you could argue the cutoff rules are both stronger and weaker. I say stronger because there is now a 1% cap on unit processes. So in terms of the mass, energy, and environmental impact, which, once again, is always kind of subjective. We don't know that with complete certainty, but we use, an educated guess based off of, LCA experts. So that's new, and I think that's fine. But I triple checked this because I just really thought I was reading it wrong. But it actually says you can have up to a 5% deviation or kind of missing information of 5% per module, and module is A1, A2, A3. Even if it was stage 1, you're talking a grand total of 85%. I suspect that this may have been an oversight. I don't think that was the intent, because typically I believe in the legacy version 21930, it was 5% for the entire model. So, and you could also argue with that 1% cap, you could never hit that, 85% or 20%, whatever it may be, sort of value for deviance. So, but just be aware, that was something that definitely caught my eye, that it just didn't quite seem to be consistent. If you have hazardous contents, you can't use cutoff criteria to kind of hide those things. That's consistent from before. Hazardous is still not defined, but that's appropriate because different regions, different industries are going to have different ways of looking at this. So I would once again encourage you, in your PCR, spell out exactly how you mean hazardous, because I have certainly seen cases in the building industry where people will do SDSs in different ways because they'll pick a kind of beneficial way of interpreting hazard or hazardous, even though there's a pretty set way of doing something like an SDS. So be very clear on that. And with allocation rules, interestingly, it really was more embraced in this version than in the past. I mean, historically, you always saw, the first rule of allocation is don't do allocation, do system expansion, do whatever you can to avoid allocation. It actually explicitly says, try to avoid using system expansion. It also calls out economic allocation as being inappropriate in certain cases. So, that's, I know, a very controversial topic. Some groups use it heavily and kind of swear by it. Others, are worried about the lack of, economic value is not a function of anything environmental. It's kind of a contrived value. So, no matter what your stance is, be very careful with this, because this is something I suspect a lot of PCRs may have to change, given that it's kind of encouraging more in here. And to be fair, there's more guidance given, but this is an area I'm actually very intrigued to see how the kind of marketplace plays out, given that this is a pretty big deviation from other ISO standards. So in terms of the impact assessment and resource metrics, very similar to before, but I do want to call out that the carbon accounting was very, very different. And I also want to share that I just heard from Chris Koppler from ThinkStep that there's apparently some revisions that may be made to the carbon accounting. There was some, I hate to use the word mistake, but some inconsistency that was found in the guidance, and I guess he alerted the authors to it. And so I just learned today that this is going to be discussed. So kind of keep your eye out on that. But what has changed in here is now you see specific guidance and rules for land use changes, carbonation, and delayed emissions. So it really seems like there was a big push to prevent things like, negative carbon footprints and whatnot on products. And, if your product holds on to the carbon for 5 years, that's no longer a storage. That is just, delayed emissions aren't necessarily given any real benefit under this. So, our industry is not super affected by this, and I'm not sure personally, I would disagree with a lot of the changes that were made, but I'm sure there are some folks that are going to feel really strongly about it. And if you're in the US, you actually default to Tracy, so it does actually put Tracy in the standard itself. One clarification, I believe it's still CML for Europe, but it actually says use EN 15804 characterization factors for Europe. So basically whatever is in 15804, and admittedly I've not looked at it for some time, so I believe it's CML, but please check me on that. You'll default to whatever the EN 15804 standard has for the European market. So in the metric reporting side, this is a lot of LCA practitioners' favorite part of the calculations. We have to report a lot of metrics across, a lot of phases. And what's kind of frustrating about this is that a lot of these metrics, namely water and waste, are really not handled very well in LCA. I mean, you don't have a waste flow in your LCIs. It's kind of unfortunate that we have to try to report these things across the board when we don't really have any data that it could possibly support, specific claims with it. So, and not to mention, there's very different ways of viewing a lot of these different resource metrics. So I want to plug the American Center for Life Cycle Assessment, or ACLCA, is publishing a resource metric guidance for the revised 21930. I'm loosely involved with it. It's being mostly powered by Christoph Koppler at ThinkStep, and I believe this will be out in the next several months. And so, not just it's going to be a guidance document, so it's not a requirement. But the aim of this guidance is to help get practitioners on the same page and prevent what kind of currently happens with these resource metrics, where you'll have a lot of people report zeros and others could be reporting values in the thousands, and there's just, to say it's not comparable is a kind of a gross understatement. Another popular and kind of controversial topic is the creation of average EPDs. There's actually some new guidance in here versus the legacy 21930. This is, of course, just an option. It's not a requirement in any sense of the word. There is a 10% limit on kind of impact categories for products under the same kind of average heading. It does seem like you can deviate from that as long as you justify why that 10% is kind of exceeded. And additional sensitivity analysis is a should in the standard, not a shall, but I think that's fair. And I appreciate that's being called out, that these sorts of average EPDs can have some pretty high uncertainty bars around them. It also does ask for a lot of specific fields. There's actually a checklist of things you must have in an average EPD. Some of these I actually do worry might make industry uncomfortable. There's things about, kind of production or imply production volume or geographical scope that I know some industries do not like reporting that at all. So I'm kind of curious if that's enforced, or if folks are okay saying, hey, we understand it's the majority of the marketplace or whatever. We're not going to make companies say we're 8.2% of the marketplace or we're only in these 13 states. So, be aware of that, but I am glad to see, more guidance being given. Average EPDs are problematic for certain industries. I'm in an industry where you really can't do them for most coating types. There's just no such thing as an average paint. Anybody who tells you there is, there's not. There's orders of magnitude difference of impact in the same product family. So that being said, there are going to be some industries where it actually works very well, where there's just a very consistent composition or the function's very straightforward or whatever. So I think, it should be encouraged if it's doable and feasible and credible, but, we also don't want to force these things because they can also get you in a lot of trouble. And another kind of important area to a lot of us related to the kind of average EPD side of things is just comparability. And has some of the similar reservations in the past, but certainly gives a lot more guidance. It explicitly requires in this section use of a functional unit, and it kind of seems to imply a cradle to grave LCA that you are looking at everything. I think that's great. There's actually a couple statements on limitations that they ask you to include. Also think that's great. And there's a long list of requirements that you have to meet in the new 21930. So they really are trying to, since a lot of the programs out there that are incentivizing EPDs essentially are asking us to do this or asking non-practitioners to make comparisons. I think the more we can standardize it, the better. But, the kind of asterisks I always put on here, especially being someone who, works very closely within the confines of the FTC green guides, is be very, very, very careful when you do this, because, there is no overall uncertainty calculation for EPDs for your whether it's carbon footprint or ozone depletion or whatever. We have a sense of if these are, reasonable and kind of credible indicators or a relatively broad uncertainty, like something like a toxicity impact. But at the end of the day, there's so many types of uncertainty, whether it's in your assumptions or your model or your data, that if you're going to make a comparison claim or a better than sort of claim, you better be really certain of that, because it's still a little bit unclear from the FTC's perspective what's kind of kosher and what's not. From my perspective, a 10% improvement is nowhere near enough to make any sort of better than an average claim. If it's within your own product, that could be a different case. If your product is, 30% better or whatever, just pick your number. But, what I would just say is be very cautious with that. Because, as I said, there's no true uncertainty measure in LCA, and I'm an LCA apologist, so I'm not trying to undercut it, but we need to be transparent that, we're doing midpoint impacts, and, when you start talking about damage and things like that, it's a totally different ballgame. Some additional references to check out. I mentioned the ACLCA guide for the resource metrics. Once again, I think for that area, which is a very confusing area in most of these standards, that should be invaluable. I did hear that there's a talk of maybe an overall 21930 guidance document from ACLCA, but admittedly, I'm not sure. So I would say test for them for it, but I'm not sure if it's even feasible from their perspective or not, but it's a possibility. I would also say check out the bibliography that's in 21930. There's 5 or 6 dozen references in there, and really that helps you understand a lot of what's in the new 21930. So if it's talking reference service life, see how ISO talks about service life or carbon footprint, whatever. It's just, there's a lot of meat there, but I think a lot of people don't see because they just see the part that's been reproduced from a new standard, and some of the nuance is kind of lost in translation there. One of my favorite resources, although admittedly this won't be really possible for some time, is finding some PCRs or EPDs that actually use the new 21930 as a kind of reference document. I have no idea. I have not seen anything out there yet that uses the new 21930. I assume it'll probably still be a few months before that occurs, but I really think that'll help a lot of us kind of wrap our mind around it and be able to visualize some of these changes and some of these assumptions, if you are struggling with them. And I've said it time and time again, but talk with your program operator, talk with your reviewer. It's really important that you're on the same page with them. I mean, you might be technically right about an assumption or an interpretation, or maybe you're both right, but ultimately, you're in most cases going to have to do what your reviewer states. So just be very cognizant of that. And some folks might be aware of Wes from EPA had published a phenomenal PCR guidance document several years ago. At this point, I actually don't know if it's going to be updated. I did see Wes last week at the ACLCA conference, but failed to ask him. So, I would love to see that, but, I'm not sure if that's even feasible from his perspective. So before I wrap up here and hand it off to Kim, I do want to mention just a few concerns that I have kind of from an industry point of view. And I want to also say again, but I do think the changes by and large are good. I just want to make sure, we don't lose sight of how EPDs and PCRs are being used, and, what some of the results mean, if you will, or the limitations of LCA. So, I am concerned, my industry is concerned, in terms of the EN 1504 module framework. It's really almost adding an order of magnitude to the number of values we have to report. And we've already gotten pushback from, our customers of our existing EPDs that, it's great, but there's just so much kind of LCA boilerplate and numbers in there that they don't really know what to hone in on. And you can argue that's, that's fine. It's still a technical deliverable. But, we certainly want to be able to, give them something to help them, feel more empowered, and it's valuable and actionable. And I'm worried that, what we're kind of giving them is going to be too technical to really be actionable at all. The resource metric reporting is still problematic at best. Hopefully the guidance document that ACLCA will create will help. But really, this is something that I do wish ISO was more firm on, because the guidance document is not going to be a requirement. So you're still going to have a lot of deviation in how these values are going to be calculated. And, things like waste, it's unclear to me, why we have to report this off of 17 different modules when we can't even say with much certainty what it is in any one of those. So, I'm a little bit concerned about some of the, let's call it a deviation in uncertainty between some of the different things that we have to track in the LCA. And the last thing I want to do is undercut some of the more comfortable or I hate to say credible indicators, because we kind of force something in there, but LCA is just maybe not quite there yet. One very specific thing I want to call out, and this is admittedly the most, I'll say, egregious example of this is specific to my industry, but I did notice that some of the language and the terminology actually was in direct conflict with existing regulations for certain regions. So the example I'm thinking of is the definition that is used in 21930 for volatile organic compounds, or VOC, is not a regulatory definition. If we reported VOC that way, we would not be legally compliant. So I understand from an LCA model, it's maybe fine to think that the way that they are, but we do report VOC content, in our EPDs, as well as, on product labels and stuff. So, to be fair, that's not the job of this ISO standard to have, every sort of term vetted across all regulations, but just be cognizant of that, because there are a lot of regulations that treat some of the terms in 21930 very specifically. And the last thing you want to do is to, have the same deliverable or same to say VOC content, but you're giving 3 different numbers and just confusing the heck out of someone because this guy or this standard told you to do it that way. I mean, at the end of the day, this is a voluntary standard for LCA. LCA is not a legal requirement. So in my mind, the environmental regulations, should always trump this. But that's a conversation I'll be having with my reviewer, I'm sure, in a few months. And so to wrap things up, I do believe that the changes to 21930 really do make it more rigorous, and I really do appreciate all the guidance it's given. I do believe that if you already were doing kind of best practices and being very deliberate in your assumptions, you probably aren't going to have to do a lot of huge changes to your model. It's probably going to be more of a function of reorganization. If maybe you were more aggressive in some of your assumptions, or use maybe a consequential LCA, they say attributional. So if you had consequential, which I'm not sure anyone does that with PCRs, but you might be back at a drawing board. So certainly, make sure and check to see how much this is going to touch you, and it will be on a case-to-case basis. There will be a learning curve when you're doing the assessment and also when you're being assessed. So once again, have a dialogue. That's the best way to do these sorts of things. I do believe that some of the reporting might confuse users. Maybe it's an opportunity just to have better education. But I'm a little bit skeptical on some of this. And I do think that in terms of the assumptions, that the harmonization that took place with 15804 is really a good thing. I mean, I'm really quite happy to see much better cross harmonization here, because it opens up the door for kind of mutual recognition between the US and EU. Now, with PEF, with the Product Environmental Footprint Project, that's a whole different ballgame. But I think this is going in the right direction, where we shouldn't be doing LCIA in a radically different way in the US versus the EU, assuming we have comparable, data and understanding and things like that. So I think that this was all heading the right direction. And, I'll be very curious how all of this plays out over time. And so with that, I will hand it off to Kim Lewis to talk about the Program Operator Consortium.
Thanks, Doug. I'm Kim Lewis, Transparency Report Program Coordinator for Sustainable Mines. As many of you know, the Program Operator Consortium is aligning around Part A, which is part of the Sustainable Mines two-part PCR framework, which complies with ISO 14025 and the ISO 14040 series, and builds on EN 15804. So Part A provides all of the general LCA calculation rules and all of the EPD content requirements. So to be able to use Part A with other standards like the new ISO 21930, we created the compatibility appendices, which standardize the EPD content requirements for whatever PCR or other standard is used. So the way it works is that the compatibility appendix identifies all the additional content required by the standard or the existing PCR that is not already required in the Part A EPD content requirements. And as with working with all standards, remember to ask, when should a PCR be compliant with ISO 21930? It's not necessarily required for LEED or other green rating systems, so what's the reason for using it? Well, consider your audience. So if content required is useful, who is it useful to? So when we standardize EPD content, it ensures that we're all using the same LCA calculation rules and reporting the same content. So only the formats are different. So it's EPDs or transparency reports. So the transparency report is designed not to make a manufacturer create two documents. So there's no need for a summary or an EPD summary. They're just 3 pages, and then all the content not required by Part A can be found on a 4th page. So in this example, anything required by ISO 21930 that's not in Part A will be placed on a page 4. So this is what the existing compatibility appendices look like, separated into standards and PCRs, including an appendix for the previous version of ISO 21930. This is it. So you can see side by side the Part A EPD content requirements and then the additional EPD content required by ISO 21930. So for 2018, we again have our annual review of Part A, which allows for continuous improvements so that we can stay current and aligned to industry standards and needs, and it's based on learning and engagement. So part of the 2018 update will be an update to the ISO 21930 compatibility appendix to reflect the new version. So watch for reminders about the public comment period and give us some feedback. We welcome all comments.
Great. Thank you so much, both of you. We have a number of questions that have come in, so I'm just going to dive in, and whomever can help answer these, please jump in. First question that we got in is the 10% limit on impact categories for average EPDs based on the coefficient of variation across impact categories, or simply as a percent difference?
That's a great question. I read it as the second of that, but it's just kind of a straight 10%. But that is probably a clarification that needs to be made. So that's something I would encourage. If you're worried about that, to kind of engage your program operator or your reviewer just to make sure. One thing I do want to point out with that, though, is that it did say that could be exceeded as long as you justify it. So I think their goal is just that you can't put everything under one kind of average heading, and they're completely different impact profiles. So I think as long as it's reasonable, that shouldn't be a challenge for you. But I'm speculating a bit.
Okay, great. Next question. Is ISO 21930 actually final and published, or still under development?
It is final and published. It was published in July of this year. I think almost everyone in LCA had seen a table draft that was kind of going around, but it is formally published and available for purchase as of right now.
Great. And you mentioned that there may be changes or adjustments coming through. What is the protocol once that happens?
Admittedly, I'm not certain. So I might defer. I'm not sure if Jessica, if you would have more insight onto it. So as I said, I did hear that there was kind of feedback given from the tag, or I forget the exact board name that ISO uses, but that they had been kind of alerted to a possible inconsistency, and it sounded like that there might be some changes made. So I'm not sure what their protocol is, but I do know it was specific to the carbon accounting side. So I would say, we can keep everyone posted on that, but I'm admittedly not sure of their protocol regarding, a notice of a change.
Okay. Doesn't sound like Jessica has any additional insight into that, but good to know. Thanks. Is 5.3 in any way indicating that for an industry-wide EPD, manufacturers who did not participate in the LCA study can use the EPD to represent their product?
That's a phenomenal. I actually appreciate that was asked. That I believe did not see that anywhere. So, and I think LEAD has done maybe more of the setting. It's kind of understood that if you don't participate in the industry average EP, that you cannot use it. So I did not walk away from this guidance with anything other than that same interpretation. So it would not make sense to me to allow people who did not participate to use it. I mean, there's no incentive to be a part of it then. So I would like to think that would still very much be the case. But admittedly, average EPDs or industry average EPDs are still a very kind of sticky wicket right now within LCA and EPDs. So I'm not even sure that there's a hard rule that's going to not be changed in the next 12 months.
Sure. Another interesting question that we got in: if you sell a product in both the US and Europe, and with the changes between EN 15804 and ISO 21930, do you need to have two separate PCRs and separate EPDs?
That's another great question. Man, I'm not even sure if that's a common occurrence. It could happen to our industry for sure. I don't think you necessarily need two separate PCRs. I mean, at least in some of our PCRs, we've actually given the out for kind of a European assumption. So, use CML or use recipe, whatever. But I think you at the very least would have to report your indicators using both methods. So you'd have to report the Tracy values and presumably the CML values. And I have seen that in some EPDs before. So I suspect at a minimum that would have to be the case. Now, if you do have a product type that is, for whatever reason, functionally different between the two regions, so I'll keep using my industry as an example. Coatings in Europe aren't really the same as coatings in the US. There's just very different ways of, it's just kind of culturally different regarding how long they should last and how they should perform, and even substrates that are used. So that can be cases where maybe it's better to have a separate PCR because you just don't test them the same way and things like that. But I don't think that that should have to become the norm. Although, you know, I know some groups want to do more global PCRs, but, you know, that's challenging to do. So I would say at a very least, I'd be prepared to report both sets of impact assessment results. And, you know, as an absolute worst case scenario, yes, I could see you and maybe, to keep putting NSF on the spot, maybe they're aware of cases where that's happened, but it wouldn't surprise me if certain groups would have to publish separate EPDs just because of differences in the core product.
Yeah, and this is Jessica from NSF. So, Doug, just to add to that, I would agree. Really, the only differences that we're seeing come through NSF International is the fact that we need to issue, similar to what Kim was reviewing, sort of that compatibility appendix. But what we're trying to do is find a simpler way to just address the differences. But yeah, as far as having to create something completely separate, that really shouldn't be necessary.
Great, thanks, Jessica. What reference service life does the paint industry use? Is this self-declared or based on an ASTM or other standard?
Someone's trying to be nice to me. That's a great question. What we did was actually industry standards, and I could also talk about this for days, so I'll try to limit my response here. But so we do it differently for interior coatings versus exterior versus stains. And so for, let's say, interior coatings, it's the function of ASTM test method results for opacity, burnish, washability, and scrubbability, and those are kind of the gold standard tests. And then based off the performance in those tests, you're assigned a kind of a low, mid, or high quality designation, which then corresponds to a lifetime. And so a high quality interior paint might be assumed to last 15 years, whereas a low quality might last 3 years. And then to further kind of bolster our results, we also require what we call a market-based lifetime to be calculated. And so that's just based off of average repaints. We don't, because with coatings, some people like to, you know, repaint, change colors more consistently. Other folks, they wait till that thing absolutely fails and then they'll kind of touch it up. So we didn't want to put the focus just on the kind of average, which is going to be wrong more often than it's right, or just put the focus on laboratory results. And so we encourage reporting both. But everything is a, you know, ASTM test method. And then for like roof coatings, for that PCR, it's actually a suite of tests. So there's an ASTM standard specification that we use based off of the chemistry type. And, you know, it's worked, I think, fairly well for us. There certainly were some hiccups in terms of kind of extreme circumstances, like I didn't realize, I should say, that primers didn't go through all the same testing as a top coat did. So we had to make some revisions to our PCR to account for some of those, I'll say, outliers. But I think by and large, not to speak for the industry, but I think it has worked well for us.
Great. I know we are just about out of time, but we have 3 more questions I'll go through quickly. First, is there a maximum number of pages required in the EPD?
No, I do not believe so. I know I've seen hints of page count, but I do not recall anything, and I would actually be very surprised if they put it in. I would say, you know, realistically, use your best judgment. I don't think people want to see a 400-page EPD. But, you know, I think that would be short-sighted to say, oh, it can't be more than 10 pages.
And for industry average EPDs, is there a requirement for the EPD to include a minimum percentage of sales of the product?
You know, it wasn't explicitly said. I personally think there should be. I don't think you should let, you know, X number of mom and pop ones dictate a data point that then the whole industry gets hit against. That's my personal philosophy. But no, I did not see anything that said, you know, 10% of the industry must be covered. And admittedly, it does get a bit complicated because for some industries, they can be dominated by 1 or 2 players. And so without those 1 or 2 players, it could really never happen. And others, it's maybe more evenly distributed. And so it's just, you get 20 groups and you hit it. So once again, I would say use your best judgment. I think I'd be very careful about groups trying to do an average EPD without having some major players involved, only because it's we're going to be held against that number regardless. And so if it doesn't represent what a typical product X actually is, that can be quite dangerous. So you certainly should be cognizant of that. But once again, to circle back on the question, I did not see any specific guidance regarding that whatsoever.
Great. And our final question: if use of 21930 is not required for lead credit, what is required for an EPD to be acceptable for a lead credit?
So lead right now, you can just do a straight kind of LCA, which I think would have to be 14025, and that gets you, I believe, a quarter credit. And then if you have an industry average EPD, that gives you half credit, and that industry average EPD would have to be 21930 or 15804 compliant. And then you get full credit. It's a product specific EPD, which has to be either 21930 or 15804. So no matter what, if you're trying to get full lead credit, you want to be using either 21930 or 15804. It's going to be case to case which one of those is better suited. Now they're quite easy, or quite similar rather. So it might not be as hard of a line as it used to be, but you have to do one or the other for full credit under lead. And I've seen a lot of groups shy away from just the kind of general LCA because it's I don't want to say frowned down upon, but it's maybe not the highest bar to have to clear. Whereas you start talking about 21930 and 15804, and then the PCR process, you really feel much more comfortable and confident in your results, that there's a number of standardizations rather than just the really kind of core general ISO rules, which, don't get me wrong, they're not bad. It's just they're meant for kind of everything. So the more specific you can be around, a building product and then your product category, I think the better job you can do, and the more actionable and meaningful the results are.
Great. Thanks so much, Doug. And we have made it through all of our questions just in time. So thank you so much for all of this great information that you provided, as well as Kim. Thank you. And for all of the attendees, keep an eye out for the next webinar invite on final benchmarking guidance.
Thank you.